So thank you for inviting me to speak with you today and share our experience with the YODA project, which is an acronym for Yale Open Data Access. I didn't start the project, but my claim to fame is I came up with the abbreviation as a Star Wars fan, so hopefully we won't get sued by George Lucas. A couple of disclosures. So what I wanted to do is share with you our model and our experiences with the YODA project. We've been up and running for about 5 years now in our efforts to share clinical trial data. And then really talk about some of the lessons we've learned in this data sharing space over the few years. And I think we can discuss further in the open discussion some potential lessons learned that have helped us that may apply to how journals and publishers are addressing this challenging but important issue. So why do we do what we do? The YODA project, we're all researchers. So we're health services researchers and clinical researchers. We're not necessarily in this to create a new data sharing platform. Basically, the mission or the overarching principles of the YODA project are that we are trying to help to promote the generation of new knowledge, helping the science move ahead, trying to ensure that we are helping to promote the responsible conduct of research, which in our minds means ensuring the optimal and maximal degree of transparency and openness, which includes sharing. We're striving to ensure good stewardship of research data, which ensures that it's appropriately saved and shared. Finally, and most importantly, we are aiming to promote the rights of research participants, the partners in research who really have signed up for this with the idea that they are trying to promote the public good. And there's no way to do that if the data are kept locked away somewhere. So how do we do this? So we are an independent academic third party without interest in the data. We're hopefully removing the perception of influence over access to the data. Our data sharing partners, and the one I will speak about most specifically today is our partnership with Johnson & Johnson, have given us full jurisdiction to make decisions about how we decide which investigators can gain access to the data in general, and then we review the individual applicants. We've established policies and procedures that are in the best interest of the scientific profession and investigators, the patients and research subjects, and also the data holders, because it's important to acknowledge that, particularly when there are large global institutions or corporations, they have legitimate concerns over ensuring that the data are used appropriately. So our partnership with J&J began about 4 years ago, and the initial scope was for sharing clinical trial data for all pharmaceutical products, including historical trials, meaning trials that were conducted years before that, and device and diagnostic products from that point, from 2014 onward. We created a website which provides information on the available trials, as well as supporting documentation. So we've been, over the years, revamping our website, so now you can search by the drug name, class of drug, et cetera, really trying to make discoverability as easy as possible at least once someone finds our website. When an investigator has an interest in accessing data, they submit a proposal to us via an online platform, providing a narrative summary of what they aim to do. We make the abstract of approved proposals public, so anybody can see who's using the data and what they're exploring. In the proposal, it's pretty brief. We ask them to provide a background, describe the significance and objectives of their work, study design, what are the outcomes, and a statistical analysis plan. And so this is really a controlled access format. People need to submit a proposal, get approval in order to gain access to the data. That being said, we have a pretty low bar in the sense that we're asking that these proposals simply be coherent, logical, sensible, feasible. We're not trying to review this like an NIH studies section where we're only letting 15% of the people get access to the data. At the end of the day, more than 90% of people who request access to the data get it, and we can talk more about that. Investigators are asked to submit a conflict of interest statement and also a timeline and dissemination plan. One of the things that we struggled with was some of our stakeholders had a concern, again, for some of these products that are being marketed, that, what if someone gets the data and it's like a trial lawyer who's trying just to massage the data to show that new drug A is harmful. So we wanted to try to ensure this is for scientific purposes. So what we asked of our data users is that they clearly state that their intent is scientific, and also that their mechanism of disseminating the results of their work is through a scientific forum, either a meeting or a journal, something like that. So this I'll cover really briefly. So people, they submit their proposals to us. We perform our standard review, which is the lower middle box there, which is pretty much everything I described. If the scientific purpose is unclear, we ask them to revise it in the bottom middle. If the request is not for a scientific purpose, we either ask them to clarify or we'll reject it. Now in the top, if it is for a scientific purpose, then we go to our partner and ask them to ensure that the trials are available, that the data, are they in a safe harbor, meaning are the data already de-identified, is it accessible? Because what we found is that some of these data requests were for trials that were done 15 years ago, and J&J is this huge conglomerate, and sometimes they couldn't even find these old trials that were conducted by a partner company that wasn't theirs at the time. The vast majority of the time they do have the data. But here's the big question behind all this, because we're putting all these efforts into making data available, and whether it's journals or people like us who are establishing these other data sharing platforms. The real question is, will the scientific community use these data? And there are some initial publications which really threw a shot across the bow at efforts such as ours, saying maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Maybe it's not worth the effort. Because the budget, and again, this is something we'll talk about later, is not small. It's really expensive. For J&J to make some of these trials available, they actually had to go back to old, sometimes paper documents and put them into electronic format. I mean, they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on some of these trials just to make the data available. So this was a publication by Strom et al. In 2016, where they looked at another data sharing platform, clinicalstudydatarequest.com, started by Glaxo, but several other pharmaceutical companies chipped in, and they made 3,000 trials ostensibly available. And what these investigators did is they said, well, what happened? After all these trials were available, who used them? Were there any publications? So let's jump to the end. By August of 2016, 2 years later, they said there had been 200 proposals, but only 4 publications. And the way that was messaged in this paper was, maybe it's not worth it. 3,000 studies available, 4 publications. Similarly, another group looked at not only CSDR, but also the Yoda project and a Duke group called SOAR, and they said, okay, now there are 3,200 total trials available, and that by March 2016, another 200 proposals had been received and only 1 publication. So the initial assessment was pretty darn negative about whether the scientific community was really beating a path to our door. So my goal today is to dispense that myth. So we've done a few studies, and I think this will be a nice complement to Elizabeth's description of their surveys. So we surveyed investigators who had used BioLink data. BioLink is through the NIH LBI, a large consortium of cardiovascular trials. And they had 441 investigators had requested access to that, to trials through that repository. We had 195 completed the survey. And of these, 98 had completed the project and 66 had published it. So again, we had a longer lag time than the prior investigators. Some of these people had received the data 5 or 6 years ago. But I think that longer lag time allowed people to actually analyze the data. Speaking of this issue of how different journals vary in their data sharing requirements and expectations, we surveyed investigators in who had published in 3 prominent journals that had data sharing expectations, either a requirement for sharing or at the least a requirement for having a data sharing plan in their manuscript. And then in that was Annals. And in the Annals of Internal Medicine, we then found the investigator who said, we will share data. So basically all of these investigators we surveyed were basically had either published in a journal that said they would share or in their own manuscript said that they would share. And we found 89 total manuscripts, and of those who responded to our survey, basically 35% of them had received at least one request for for sharing, and that translated to 68 requests for individual studies, 59 of which had been granted. So 59 times people are asking these people for their data, and the mean time since publication here was just about 1.5 years. So making these available, people are asking for it. And you might ask about what's our experience in the YODA project? Who's asking us for data? And again, as you can see, it's a slow but really consistent and steady increase in the number of requests we've been getting over time. And now we have almost 100 different investigators have requested data through our site. And the typical investigator requests 3 different studies. So just to go through this briefly, we have at this time I put this together, when we had 90 requests, 82 were approved. And of those that were approved, just to jump down, 82 were granted access, 13 projects have already been completed and submitted to journals. Oops, oh boy. And we now have 6 publications that we're very, very proud of. So to transition to next steps, I just wanted to summarize that I think it really takes time for the scientific community to buy into this and become excited about the fact these data are available. But they are being used, and I think this is really going to reach an inflection point soon. But as far as these challenges to consider, one big one is who should pay for this. I mean, we're very fortunate in the YODA project because, again, this is not our day job. We have this partnership with Johnson & Johnson, which provides some funding for us to help to make these data available. As far as incentives, large pharmaceutical companies are actually far ahead of academics and foundations in this world. And so the question is, what about everyone else? How can we incentivize sharing? And what are the incentives for sharers and users that will promote greater success? Sometimes, we talk about financial incentives, but frankly, academic credit is a really important thing. It's funny, there was one prominent critic of the status quo in research who was really pushing for more data sharing. And when we showed this person our types of research proposals that we had been receiving, he actually said, well, they're all so boring. This is incredibly boring. And then we asked, well, what do you mean by that? And the response that we got surprised me. He said, actually, these are all people that are trying to answer new questions. They're taking existing trial data, and they're trying to really do something new. And my natural response is, as a scientist, is, well, why is that boring? And actually, he said, the reason why I value data sharing is I want someone to validate the original findings. That's exciting. And there's a really interesting discrepancy there between what we're trained to do something new and different, and maybe what the world really needs is someone to objectively go and validate. That's something maybe we could talk about later. Getting stakeholders on board is a key challenge, and again, engaging the research community to use data, and also the process. What are the best practices for sharing data and creating these platforms, interoperability, giving credit where it's due. And again, one thing that we've struggled with are these data use agreements, which we can talk about. But I'll stop there. Thank you.